Good afternoon, everybody. Kevin Ackland, Chief of Staff to Mayor Peduto. Thank you. Appreciate everyone being here today for our third public meeting of the Mayor's Blue Ribbon Panel. We've been assembled in an open public process to evaluate the assets and conditions of the Pittsburgh Water and Sewer Authority. Appreciate we have full participation here today of the board and the leadership at the PWSA. I know there was a vote today to raise rates and some difficult decisions that we're all facing together as a city regarding the future of our water and sewer system. So appreciate members of the panel who've been working hard over the last 6 months to help guide this process. And again, the mayor commissioned this panel for one reason, and that is to procure a number of options that we could all collectively evaluate to build the kind of water and sewer system that our city deserves. It's about water safety, it's about green infrastructure, about solving our combined sewer overflow issues. And so we've gotten to the point where IMG, who we selected to run this process, there was a public meeting last week. Today is about presenting some of the options that are before us that we can consider collectively in moving forward. So with that, I'm going to have a presentation by Steve Steckler, who's here. There'll be some questions by the panel. We also invite at the end of the presentation for members of the public to approach us to ask questions of the panel or of Steve. We intend to have a robust community engagement here. And for folks at home, you can't see, we do have a packed room. So I'm just pleased that we have so much encouragement and participation by stakeholders here in the city, a number of you who we've worked with on these issues over the last several years since we've been in office. So on behalf of the mayor, we intend to do the right thing. There are some hard decisions ahead of us, but we intend to do so in an open, public, transparent manner, and that this meeting today is yet another step towards the ultimate outcome of solving this situation, not kicking the can down the road, but obviously making some of the decisions that are necessary for us to rebuild this structure. So with that, I'll turn it over to Steve Steckler from IMG.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you again and gather here, and also all the folks in the audience as well, members of the PWSA board and its executive leadership. Today we're going to talk about the results, not so much of the early part of the assessment, where we were looking at operations, capital improvement programming, and the various business processes and financial situations, internal controls, and information technology of PWSA. But we're going to focus on the options to restructure the PWSA, what those options are, the pros and cons, how they work, the benefits, and at the end of it, we'll have a few conclusions which we'll share with you based on those. Before I start, I want to say a big thanks to the acting executive director, Bob Weimer, and to Kent Lindsay, the leadership there, for cooperating with us so much in this process, because it has been detailed. It's been a lot of work, and they've been very responsive in providing all the information that we've requested, including even working with us on the rate impact modeling, the capital improvement programming assessment, and other critical items here. So again, thank you for your cooperation in that regard. We'll begin with the context for the PWSA's restructuring, noting that PWSA has a lot of difficulties, a lot of very special difficulties, but it's also just part of a national problem that has to be addressed one way or another. Then we'll talk about the assessment process and a few of the key findings, but since we've already delivered those to you through publications, through meetings, and through publications that are on the website, I won't dwell too much on those. We'll talk about the public engagement process that we utilized. And in fact, we actually are seeing a lot of people here for the second time, at least, because of the interactive workshop that we held on Thursday to involve the public in looking at how public values translate into proactive work on behalf of a better PWSA. We'll also talk about, in particular, take a little time to talk about embracing how the city plans to embrace green infrastructure, and also to talk specifically about how the various restructuring options deal with green infrastructure and the assurance that it's used in the city where it seems to be very important. We'll then talk about those values, the Pittsburgh values. These values, these charts that you see around here were used in the public workshop to say not just point blank, we don't like this, we don't like that, we don't like this, but instead to say what's important to you in terms of labor accountability. What are your values in terms of service quality? What are the priorities here in what they want from a water and sewer system? And we'll look at those values in the context of each of the restructuring options. We'll then review the restructuring options with you and talk about how they work and tell you about the analyses that we did in support of those, looking at the restructuring options. And finally, we'll share our conclusions with you about where we are at the end of this assessment process and the information that you should want to look at very carefully as you go forward in your process. I mentioned that failing infrastructure, specifically water and sewer infrastructure, is a huge national problem. Americans use about 42 billion gallons of water a day, or about 15 trillion gallons a year. Nationwide, there's a $1 trillion backlog of capital investment for water, including a $270 billion backlog for sewer and stormwater. That $1 trillion is not easy to come by. It's raised almost entirely at the local level. And it is a pressing problem for almost every major city in the country. Every city is struggling with it, and especially now they're struggling not just with infrastructure that's reaching the end of its useful life, they're also struggling with new mandates to eliminate combined sewer overflow problems, to keep pollution from running into our rivers and water sources during storm events. The cost for that system, the cost for those improvements alone reaches the hundreds of billions of dollars. Yet despite all of these problems, and you would think that this is a national crisis that would include a national solution, and I'll tell you about one of those national solutions, you'll see how small it is compared to the scale of what's needed. We are spending our total annual spending on water infrastructure has actually declined in real terms over the past 25 years. It's declined in the face of all those growing needs, a much larger population, a fast deteriorating infrastructure that was putting, sometimes in cases well over 100 years ago, certainly the case in Pittsburgh. And PWSA has found it in a situation where it is likely among the worst performers in terms of taking care of its infrastructure of any of the systems out there in the United States. As I said, it's not alone, but it is notable. I mentioned the national spending on water and sewer infrastructure has actually declined, and what this chart shows you is the green line is the operating expenses for water and sewer infrastructure in the country. You can see sometime around 1980 that the capital expenditures started to decline, whereas they used to run fairly close together to operating expenses. The operating expenses reflect just normal inflation, increase in the number of households and water and sewer services that they use. But you can see the capital expenditures haven't kept nearly in pace with those expenditures, and that's just one snapshot of the gap out there. In looking at how this problem manifests itself in Pittsburgh, we used a multi-step process to look at the performance of the utility, to look at its likely future performance, to look at the problems that it faces, to look at the capital improvement programs that are required, and to look at the organization's capability of handling the very large expenditures need to be made. We started off with a kickoff meeting with the city, the PWSA, the utility management, and meetings with city officials. From there, we launched into a high-level service and operations assessment. We had hoped to go on a very deep dive into the operations assessment. However, one shocking issue, which both we and PWSA's current management has noted, is the rather stunning lack of information of real performance data that you would expect in a system this size. Normally, the system this size has have very robust information systems from all of the different operating processes. And that information, when you look at it, gives you a very good idea about how the utility's performed over time and where its biggest needs are. That data is sorely lacking. Now, to his credit, the acting executive director has made great steps toward trying to address that information problem, but that's a long and multi-year project. You don't suddenly go out and get literally thousands or millions of pieces of information, bits, it depends on how you divide it, of information on your water and sewer system if you haven't been collecting it before, and especially if you don't have the hardware systems, if you don't have the staff protocols to collect that information. So in a way, the utility is somewhat flying blind when it develops its programs, and again, those programs appear relatively solid here, but they are based on much more limited information than what most systems have. Having done the operations assessment, we then engage the stakeholders and the community. There are all kinds of different stakeholders in this process. Environmental groups, citizens groups, the business community, labor, all of those entities are stakeholders in this process.
Steve, just one point of clarification. You have water and sewer on the operating assessment. You only looked at water, right?
No, we also looked at what information there was available on the sewer system itself.
Just availability. Did you do an assessment of?
No, we didn't have time or the resources to go into a deep assessment of the sewer system. Most of that is underground, of course, and so we have to rely on what we can observe in terms of pump stations and the like, and also the condition information on those assets. In the public engagement process, we began and focused on the values, the values that the participants in the workshop brought to the meeting. But not just that, the values that we were able to identify from the various posts that have been made to the website. And with that, I'll let Christine Mondor of Evolve EA describe the process we went through.
As you know, I'm going to talk about two things. Our firm was brought on to look at green infrastructure, and I'm going to tell you a little bit more in depth about our findings with regards to green infrastructure, but also share with you a little bit about some exercises that the team put together in order to give the Blue Ribbon Panel and the Mayor's Office some multiple dimensions by which to think about these decisions. As you know, there are a few discrete buckets of different models and strategies that IMG was asked to look at, and we felt that it was not adequate to go A, B, or C, but that what we were hearing back from both our green infrastructure folks as well as through the website needed to be broken down into more fine detail. And the material that's around you helps you understand a little bit about the number of different concerns that people have. Every one of these categories represents somebody's concern that came through in an interview, conversation, or online. And these in particular are part of the material that came out of the workshop on November 2nd. And I really thank the members of the Blue Ribbon Panel and others who came out that night. I know there's a lot of folks here who are familiar faces, and I appreciate that. I want to give you a summary of what they are, but I encourage you to read through both the different categories that are represented here and to understand that you have a very active and engaged public. In looking at what we value, there are 7 different categories. For those of you that can't see, labor, health and safety, accountability, cost, trust and transparency, implementability, and green infrastructure. Not surprisingly, the things that folks cared about the most were accountability, cost, and green infrastructure. You can see that both in the number of dots that are on the wall, as well as the kind of bar chart that's represented in the slide. Break that down a little bit so you understand what some of the major concerns were. Accountability, the 2 largest categories are related, and those relate to the ownership of the water system and the sewer system. The water system having a magnitude of 2 times the concern of the sewer system. Certainly that is foremost in people's minds, I believe, when they think about PWSA. With regards to cost, the top 3 subcategories that people were concerned about with cost have to do with ratepayer assistance. So they have to do with making sure that people can pay their bills, making sure that we can hold their rates down, making sure that we don't do any sort of shutoffs. And so I think that that is also heard consistently through everybody's conversations. Lastly, with regards to green infrastructure. So while this was a category for the public to respond to, it also represents a deeper dive that our firm was asked to do with groups that deal with green infrastructure. So if an organization partners with or has some role in providing green infrastructure, implementing green infrastructure, or advocating for green infrastructure, we met with many of them, not all of them. There's always folks who are still out there, and that's great. I want to share with you some of those findings because while the public cited this as their 3rd most important, these experts or advocates gave us increased levels of feedback, and I want to share with you some of those. So in a kind of big picture, most of the groups that we met with were non-committal on the different models. They either didn't have enough information or didn't understand exactly which ones would be best for green infrastructure. But what they did do is to give us some key points, and I'll read through this in general, and then I'll go into a little bit more detail on these. One is that there needs to be interagency collaboration and cooperation, and whatever model's chosen has to allow for this. Second, the community organizations need to be folded into this as well. There needs to be opportunities and not lose possibilities for creative and robust funding with regards to implementing green infrastructure. And lastly, it needs to happen fairly quickly, not just for regulatory reasons, but for other kind of opportunities that are out there. Lastly, a number of groups cited that this could be a separate stormwater authority. They didn't know, does this belong into a kind of revisioned water and sewer authority, and were kind of concerned about this, especially with regards to regionalization issues. And I just want to spend a little bit of time briefly going through some of these things. It needs to be interagency cooperation so that you understand what they said with regards to that, is that knowing that part of this solution is held through DPW, through Department of Mobility and Infrastructure, through city planning, through the URA, et cetera, et cetera. It's important that whatever structure PWSA takes, that this is seamless and that type of cooperation occurs. It's concerned that this be kind of cemented into it. Right now it's happening through personalities and folks reaching out, but it needs to be part of the protocol of how they collaborate. Second point relates to that collaborative relationships that the PWSA currently has with the nonprofits that serve as advocates and sometimes service providers with regards to green infrastructure. There's no doubt that a PWSA 2.0 would take on different roles and responsibilities, but it has to be very important that the collaborative relationships that exist are continued, and that is continuing to be a partnership, and that takes an active facilitation process to understand what PWSA's Redux does and what these organizations continue to do. So that has to be cultivated, that relationship. Lastly, there needs to, or not lastly, but kind of two things, is the separate stormwater authority. A number of these organizations work in other places in the state and across the country and have access to understanding what some of these stormwater authority pros and cons are, if that's the way to go, suggesting to reach out and understand their expert capacity in that. Likewise with green infrastructure funding and the kinds of efforts that those groups are pursuing to find pots of money to understand how the market plays into this should be brought into future conversations and whatever this model is selected. Lastly, bringing up this conversation of regionalization, it seems like there have been studies and there's a goodly amount of knowledge out there about regionalization, but not perhaps yet explored through these models, and so that should be part of the conversations that we use to evaluate which of these models are most robust. So lastly, there is recommended that there be a strong statement that goes into whatever types of next steps for whatever type of organization comes out of this. And these are just some of the key points. I think this is something that needs to be written into in commitment, both from the city's side as well as from the organization's Redux, talking about, why we care, why the health of our rivers is important both to our drinking water and to our sewer system, and the kind of role that the city plays in leading that way. So I'm not going to read through that whole statement, but that some form of a statement like this be included in whatever next steps happen. So.
One additional note on green infrastructure, we've in this slide, we've actually italicized affordable strategy. And green infrastructure is a key part of that. IMG led a team of engineers, architects, planners, and landscape architects after Hurricane Sandy to try to address the rebuilding of the infrastructure there in a way that was more sensitive to the environment and did not involve, for example, large concrete and rebar seawalls and tunnels and the like to deal with future storm events and sea level rise. And in that process, even though I went to graduate school with them, I learned a new appreciation for landscape architects. And actually their ability to find very cost-effective solutions that had that resulted in significant direct reductions in the overall cost of the planned gray infrastructure. And so that's something to keep in mind, that green infrastructure is not just something nice to do for the environment. It is a powerful cost reduction mechanism for achieving the same public objectives. The citizens of Pittsburgh this was a very impressive display of not just Pittsburgh niceness. I have family in Pittsburgh, and they always talk about there is such a thing as Pittsburgh nice, but also obviously very thoughtful and engaged in this process to begin with the values and look at the restructuring options. And we received a number of public comments on that, which I'll share with you. On the, taking for the moment the option of water and sewer services remaining publicly owned and operated. And there were three essential categories that people were asked to provide comments on and translating their values into constructive options as they manifested themselves in three different models. But basically we asked their opinion and asked what questions they had. And the results were included, for example, on making internal improvements without further restructuring. Here are some of the concerns that were raised. I'm concerned this would be a half-hearted effort. We need to recruit a really good leader. I'm concerned about how much time it will take. We have political will now. What would happen down the line? Water should be publicly managed and owned. What restructuring of the board would ensure similar problems don't recur? So this is clearly what people were thinking about when they were asked about internal improvement and whether it would work and what form it would take. As for public-private partnerships, they also had additional questions. How will the current contracts be implemented? How will this save money when a profit is expected under the assumption the profit is an extra cost? How will current contracts be affected? Private capital always comes with string attached. I'm concerned about people before profit, and does the public have an influence if the private sector is involved? Again, all very good questions. On private ownership, there was clearly a concern about losing control of the water rights and its effects on health, the economy, and the community. Also very prominent was the concern about poorer service and higher rates, and wondering whether there would be a monitoring of water quality improvements, not just by PUC. And also a concern that the option of selling it to a private utility would be an easy way out, would be seen as an easy way out. Now that came as the conclusion of our assessment phase. This is just a long textual summary for your handout here, which was part of the executive summary that was provided to you earlier and is available online. When we looked at the restructuring options, we started with a baseline assumption. Now, that baseline assumption was not that nothing will happen. The baseline assumption included that PWSA will continue to make some material improvements begun under its acting director, including hiring better staff when possible, collecting and refining asset data and condition, and improving basic capital programming and operating protocols. And again, this is exactly what we're seeing, and we can expect that to continue. We do note, however, that, and in this, again, in the baseline assumption, we assume there's going to be some institutional inertia. It's very challenging for an organization to turn itself on a dime after 20 plus years as a poor performer. And finally, governance. It assumes that PWSA's governance continues unchanged, and that the organization continues excessive reliance on contractors for capital programming and asset management. That's the baseline assumption. With regard to, let's just start at the top there with governance. The Auditor General spent a considerable amount of time looking at the utilities governance. And indeed, you could say since problems start at the top, generally not the bottom, that governance over the past 20 to 25 years has been a very great challenge for PWSA. It could not have ended up in its current circumstances without that issue. And indeed, this is exactly what the Auditor General pointed out in his report. So in looking at the governance, we relied heavily on his findings and the materials that were actually used to render those findings. And you can see here the opening comment of the Auditor General's report on PWSA's governance. Let's start with the objective here. And I think this objective is shared fairly widely. The objective is to have a political independence and think long-term and strategically rather than short-term, and to have an organizational focus. And in that regard, we've invited Indianapolis in to to provide testimony to you at your last meeting. We also invited Tulsa. They have very different but very functional governance alternatives. The one in Indianapolis is not unprecedented, but it is the largest. In Indianapolis, they transferred the assets and operations to a nonprofit public charitable trust that has been around for over 100 years. And that trust is self-perpetuating. It is completely politically independent, although its members, both the Board of Trustees, which is very diversified, representative of the community, perpetuates itself and thereby keeps it apart from political interference, and a Board of Directors, which is much more of a managing board dealing with day-to-day services. We took that as one possible model. In addition, we looked at the Tulsa board. Now, the Tulsa is not the best infrastructure board out there, but it's a pretty darn good one. It's notable primarily because of the fact that its appointees are extremely high profile. I would point to a few other boards in the country, for example, the board for the Washington Metropolitan Transit Authority, the board for the Nashville Airport, the board for Seattle MSD. They all stand out for the quality and dedication of the personnel there. And it isn't just them, it's the power that board has, power and independence. Now, whether or not the current board for PWSA measures up to that, and I believe in a lot of ways it does, these boards have a tradition, a decades-long tradition of being politically independent and quite powerful. And therefore, they have been able to invest in their infrastructure, necessary infrastructure, as a matter of public trust. Yes, there are people there there are plenty of people in the public who don't want to see rate increases, and indeed, that political pressure is one of the very large reasons that PWSA has ended up in the hole that it's in. But some cities do find ways to address that. In this case, we believe that something bold is needed with regard to governance. We believe that the city should establish a nonprofit public trust based on the Indianapolis model, but with a value-based charter that provides greater and more consistent public input. We believe that the city should appoint high-profile trustees to govern the trust and appoint their board of directors. We believe that PWSA's assets and operations should be transferred in a manner that moves the assets and operations from political influence, and that it establishes, and that rate setting would then be regulated by the State Public Utilities Commission on a rate case basis. This is not a new option in Pennsylvania's context. Indeed, there's a good deal of legislation that's been offered to basically achieve the same thing by applying PUC regulation, and then going even further to establish a fully politically independent board. It's not the only governance solution, but it's certainly one that seems to arise out of the Auditor General's report. How would that work? This graphic shows that it's actually a multi-step process. In step one, the city creates a new nonprofit public trust. The terms of that trust need to be specific to Pennsylvania law, but they can also be quite different from Indianapolis, depending upon how the creators of that trust wish to imbue the trust with the values, its charter. Organizations do pay attention to their charter. They are guided by it. They are permitted to do some things and not to do others when that trust is established. And as long as the trust exists, that's the guidance that the trust has.
Could you give some examples as to what
Yes.
parameters that might be?
The parameters would include, for example, labor protections. The city of Pittsburgh has a long tradition of upholding organized labor, and that certainly is a value that could be written into the charter creating the trust. Likewise, Pittsburgh has a strong green infrastructure focus. That could be written into the trust as well, calling for conceivably a fairly detailed guidance to always include green infrastructure in its deliberations. Another is to protect low-income households in dealing with rate increases, and that's certainly an issue that ought to be at the top of everyone's agenda, considering the rate increases that are coming due in the organization with essentially $4 billion of infrastructure improvements needed over the next 30 years on a consumer base that's only 130,000 households. So all of those values need to be incorporated in the creation of the trust. This is not Indianapolis. The trust wasn't created 130 years ago to escape Standard Oil. This trust can be created in whatever format that the city chooses to do. The second part of the step is to appoint an initial board of trustees. The board of trustees would be their terms could depend upon whatever the city decides they should be, but ultimately that board, in order for the trust to become self-perpetuating and for the board to become self-perpetuating, to remove it fully from political influence, the Board of Trustees then begins to appoint itself at some point in the future, and at the very beginning it appoints a Board of Directors. The Board of Directors is actually much more involved in the day-to-day operations of the utility. I would cast it typically as something between the current PWSA board and the Tulsa TMUA board, which is a genuine managing board. That's the way the board of directors function in Indianapolis, and the city would just have to decide how they want this to function. The assets are transferred from the city to the nonprofit trust. After the assets are transferred, the operations are transferred from PWSA's control to the nonprofit trust. And at that point, the authority is public, it is independent, and it is empowered.
How do we then ensure that that delegation of individuals, that comes from an apolitical process and is representative of the community? Because you talked about it being a very powerful board. And so how would you envision that structure to occur in terms of identifying those initial board of trustees, which is really crucial, I think, in this
Yes.
particular model?
Well, this is actually an opportunity for the city to ensure that that the community gets exactly what it wants out of those appointments. I would hesitate to say that I wouldn't necessarily say that the charter should include that the board of trustees shall include this kind of person and this kind of person with this background and this expertise and things like that. But rather that the mission statement for the Board of Trustees say something to the effect that it is representative of the community, and of course then leave it to the people making the appointments to ensure that representation is there, either through the city through the city of course, but through the mayor or the city council and whomever. But at some point, and that's why it says initial Board of Trustees, at some point there's a transition to a more permanent, self-perpetuating body. And that's certainly the case in Indianapolis, where the trustees do rotate, but some of them serve relatively long terms.
Just to add to that, Michelle, I think that's the key issue here, and perhaps the panel can provide guidance in response as to what the parameters of the selection of the trust is. You know, the challenge of removing it from the political cycle is you remove it from the political cycle, but if you have a sort of an administration that wants to, you know, hire ward chairmen and put them into jobs at PWSA or misuse and not fund, you know, for example, as we've seen in the past, that's one of the backsides of being subject to the political cycle. So I think as part of the implementation of the Auditor General's recommendations, if this is a path of corporate governance that we collectively wanted to go down, I think your question as to how do you initially select that trust board, and then how does that board perpetuate itself in a sort of inclusive manner with respect to all the stakeholders. I think that would likely be the work that we would invite from the panel as to how look at models as to where this has worked, you know, in a way that keeps the kind of democratic process still there, even though you're insulated from politics. So,
Kevin, do you want to continue this discussion now, or should we wait? Because I have some questions too.
it's up to you. Yeah, if you want to. I think if we're on this page, I'm help.
Sure.
Yeah.
When I've discussed the public trust idea with some people, including the structure you put here with a board of trustees and a board of directors, a good question that elicits is, why have two boards? It seems like we're adding layers of bureaucracy. Why not one board?
I can tell you why Indianapolis did it, and actually it's very surprisingly well. The Board of Trustees really are trustees. They don't really have a role in the day-to-day management. They view themselves as having a higher level mission that doesn't go too far beyond the mission statement of the trust. And so it's a relatively large group. The Board of Trustees is larger than the Board of Directors, and that's by design. It means the authority to appoint managing directors is relatively dispersed, therefore more democratic, and actually I believe it's a good idea not to have someone that appoints the board of directors not to be the board of directors, to actually keep their eye on that top level mission for the authority or for the
All right, I got
trust.
that. But they also had a special situation in that they had this long-standing public trust for their gas utility.
Mm-hmm.
And then later they added water.
Yes.
And given that model, it makes a lot of sense, or it makes more sense, to have a board of trustees over the whole thing, and then separate boards of directors for the individual infrastructure systems.
It depends upon the nature of what you want your board to do. As I said, there are some boards which are high-level boards. There are other boards which are managing boards. And a managing board doesn't mean, by the way, that you have a neutered executive director. It means that you simply have a group of people who volunteer a lot of their time and develop a certain governance level expertise in the operations, maintenance, asset management, and capital programs. Tulsa is one of those boards. I mentioned Nashville's airport, which is surprising because those folks on the Nashville Airport Board include the CEOs of some of the largest companies in Nashville, yet that's a managing board. So again, it depends on the expectation. I think it's a healthy thing to have a managing board and not just to rely on an executive director. We've worked with tons of authorities, different kinds of authorities, water, sewer, airport, and you never want the fate of your authority, of your authority to come down to the personality of the executive director, personnel capability of the executive director. As nice as that sounds, fine, it just makes the system vulnerable.
Another area of a major issue is whether there are legal issues that would have to be overcome or contractual issues that would have to be overcome. The one thing I got out of the Westlaw analysis, which was
Yes.
quite helpful, was basically their conclusion that whatever you do, it's going to require cooperation by the city and PWSA.
Yes.
That is, there may be authorities under the Municipal Authorities Act, et cetera, but in the end, if we don't have that cooperation, that is, if everybody doesn't agree, we're not going to be able to get this done. Is that
Right. Yes, I think that's true.
Are there particular legal or contractual issues that have to be confronted, though, to set up such an entity?
I believe our conclusion was that it's not challenging to do that. What's challenging is the transfer of the assets, more challenging, I should say, is the transfer of the assets and the authority into the trust. Not that it just takes time to do that. Creating the trust, that's why the stepwise, the creation of the trust, simply the creation of the trust and appointing a board of trustees is a relatively quick first step. From there, you have to go a little further in terms of transferring assets, obligations, operations, various authority, things like that.
Can I keep going? I have one more. I promise, Kevin, this will be the last one. So back to the Board of Trustees or the Board of Directors, and let's assume we have both. The argument for trust on the part of the public is we've got high-profile people that have earned the respect and trust of the public, and therefore they'll trust the authority. That's different, of course, from actual public input. And one of the virtues of some measure of political control is the mayor can always recall or fire the board members that he's appointed. When you have a public trust with its own self-perpetuating board, is there such a mechanism? I mean, could the public call for a recall or a...
We can bake that in. Nothing says that we would have to replicate the Indianapolis model to the letter. This trust is an opportunity to form it in any manner that best suits.
Are you familiar with variations on the model that involve that or include that kind of direct public?
Well, advisory committees are always the easiest. By the way, there are only two large water utility public trusts in the U.S.
I would say, Jerry, to that question, and I'm not a trust and estates lawyer, but presumably you can establish a trust that inures to the benefit of the residents of the city of Pittsburgh that has very specific guidelines in the trust, restrictions that govern the operation of these assets, to include some of the things that Steve mentioned, that also include definitions of cause for trustees to be removed upon some moving. The also benefit is that trust instrument would be presumably under the auspices of the Orphans Court or some public body where the public or anybody could bring petitions in front of a court similar to any other trust, such as the will for the Shenley Park that was granted to us, and the like. So all of those things go through Orphans Court. So we have not yet delved into the legal machinations of what it would take to set up this trust, other than to say that, based upon this initial kind of conversation, I think it's interesting for us to look at this option as a way to, as the Auditor General mentioned, depoliticize. Politics has clearly caused some of the problems that we have at PwC. There's no doubt in my mind, when we took office, we had no-show jobs for political people, ward chairpersons who had worked there for years. We all know that's happened. It has not happened under our watch. And I think depoliticizing this while keeping this asset and this system accountable to the public, this is a worthwhile, in my mind, structure to at least for us to consider.
May I just ask one more question about the Board of Trustees?
Yes.
You had mentioned that individuals on that board could potentially be there for decades.
You can, as I said, it happens that in Indianapolis, Dan Evans, the trustee, president of the Board of Trustees who came to speak with you, had been on it a number of years. I don't know exactly how long, but I certainly know it was longer than 4 years.
So there's no rotation schedule to rotate off in terms of
Again,
getting a healthy new perspective.
I'm not
of the
certain
trustees.
specifically about Indianapolis, but that is certainly something that you would want. I would think you would want that, to have a regular rotation, staggered terms, once it gets up and going. And also, with regard to regionalization, the trustees have the ability to themselves to dissolve the trust, subject to the requirements of the charter creating the trust, such that if there were ever a regional authority created in the greater Pittsburgh metropolitan area, then the trust would not be a barrier to that.
Could you, a point I wanted to follow up on, because as you read your report and we talked about regionalization, what you're really saying is presently PWSA is not a candidate for regionalization because they don't have the credibility with some of the other players.
Yes.
Now, when I read that in your report, presumptively I was assuming that the longer-term objective would have been to put PWSA into such a position that indeed some type of regional solution would have been more plausible.
Right. This is one solution for getting there.
Well, okay, but that's an important understanding to make, that what we're trying to do is make PWSA more attractive so that we can get a regional solution, so that the end goal is the regional solution, not simply the improvement of PWSA.
I would agree with that. Could
we so articulate that? Because the way it stands right now, regionalization is sort of dismissed because they're not attractive to anybody.
Right.
But then to go on to say that if we design a trust agreement, or if we look at some other way of dealing with what we all agree is the conflicted leadership right now, that there is no PWSA. PWSA can't be an adjunct to the city any longer. That's what we're trying to do.
That can be written again. That could be written into the charter of the trust.
But I want it to become more apparent in your presentations, I guess is what I'm saying, because in the end, I think we all agree that our solutions have got to be regional, whether it's dirty water, clean water, or stormwater. So what we're really trying to do is to create the environment in which that can occur. So there's an end game here for us to consider whatever arrangement, so that even if the trust understands that its long-term objective might be exactly that, to go out of business, and we've articulated that, I'm a lot more comfortable with that than creating an instrument that, oh, by the way, if they wanted to, they could do that. Once you create something, it's...
No, that's a fair assessment. Certainly there are a lot of dead weight bodies out there that got created, and nobody does anything about them once they've reached their shelf life.
So just to sort of wrap at least my question up, then to more clearly articulate that in your briefings and presentations would be something that you would be willing to do, because I do think we all agree that ultimately that's where we would like to be.
As with the change in governance, the assisted internal improvement option becomes even more feasible because the trust is much freer in terms of its activities, and with regard to rates as well, to execute an improvement plan. And that's one of the objectives of setting up the independent trust. In this structure, this shows what can be accomplished under an internal improvement structure. This essentially, these orange boxes really are talking about the points of vulnerability in PWSA. And so in each of those boxes, you see tools. This is basically a toolkit for PWSA to use in order to achieve and maintain a higher level of performance. There is one key ingredient here, and that is changing the lease agreement between PWSA and the city into a performance contract document. That performance contract document begins with and you can see the yellow circle circling the city PWSA lease agreement. It begins with a binding strategic business plan that essentially constitutes a performance contract, an annual performance contract between the city and PWSA. It is, the strategic plan is a long-term contract. The annual utility performance agreement is an annual contract. The performance parameters and the action items in the business plan get written into the budget and human resources working groups, essentially making sure that the budget that's established adheres to the long-term objectives of the business plan to which the city and PWSA have agreed. Or in this case, it can be, this can be done without a trust, I'm sorry. The third element is support service contracts. The city of Pittsburgh provides support services to the PWSA. One of the arguments that has been made, just one of the arguments, is that the value of those services either exceeds or is not commensurate with the payment for those services, and that PWSA has a little control over the quality of those services. That's actually surprisingly common out there, where a city has different types of departments, human resources, legal, procurement, et cetera, which the authority uses to provide those support services. And invariably, the utility authority often believes that those services, the quality of those services, or the responsiveness of those services, or the price of those services leaves a lot to be desired. So in this case, those standards are negotiated up front, again, in the form of an amendment or a component of the larger annual performance agreement. Number 4 is very important, and that's a performance management information system. The systems in a utility, at least the ones that are up to date, turn out an enormous amount of very, very useful information. That information needs to be consolidated, analyzed, and subject to business intelligence tools that I know that both Bob and Kent Lindsay are very familiar with. And the value of those tools is very important. And there are some plans already underway in PWSA to eventually achieve a level where business analytics can be used as part of the planning process. The 5th is an optimized operations and maintenance protocol and CIP, again, driving out of the budget, but based on some very important systems, and specifically a strategic asset management system and protocols of criticality analysis. I will say that a lot of utilities think they do it right, but I don't believe they do. We have a lot of experience in working with a lot of different types of infrastructure facilities, and the asset management systems that we see out there and that are believed to be, and protocols specifically that people believe to be high quality and state of the art, are typically, for example, those are shunned by private operators. And in fact, they have systems because the bottom line, not that it doesn't matter to a public authority, but it is a mission for a private entity, and therefore the strategic asset management systems employed by private operators and the protocols they use for developing asset registries, hierarchies, and conducting criticality and risk analysis are considerably more advanced than the typical municipal utility. Those types of systems have value in a public system if they're adopted there. The seventh is new information governance tools. If you're going to have a board that's going to be a managing board and that's going to be fully informed, it needs to have reliable, thorough, and up-to-date information on the performance of utility in all respects. The most basic of that is a monthly operating report. That's a basic report on the functioning of the utility in terms of doing its job to provide clean water and to clean the wastewater. The notion is that the performance information system rolls up into a specific governance tool so that when the board members come into a meeting every 2 weeks, they have in front of them several sheets of paper. On those sheets of paper, there are dashboards, there are summary measures, and pretty much the individual board member, who really only requires about 15 minutes to read the report and understand it, especially if they've been seeing it every 2 weeks, become extremely well informed of what the utility is up to and how it is tracking toward the utility's strategic objectives, not just the budget year, that's included too, but also toward its strategic objectives. And finally, to go along with that, there is some great value, not all boards have to have it, but there's some great value in having a board coordinator, an individual or more, who is an analyst, who is specifically empowered and capable of supporting the board's decision-making, even publicly, privately, and to provide them the type of performance information and recommendations that they require. This is not a substitute for an executive director. This is a person who is a relatively mid-level staff and analyst level at best. But it's simply a person who is a staff person who's able to keep the board informed and essentially a gopher for their higher level analytical needs, information needs. I think I familiarized you with the features there as we ran through the orange boxes. And indeed, many utilities that are now considered very high performing became that way because they went through a shock treatment of an internal improvement program, generally what we call assisted internal improvement, an outside party who was basically helping them and keeping tabs on and reporting to the board. However, experience shows that if you want to operate the utility at a very, very aggressive level, where as an anecdote, every person in the utility, every manager, every staff person comes in every day thinking, how can I make this work better? And there are systems there to help them and help them and encourage them to do that. How can I save money? How can I work to hold down rates? Now, a lot of people at PWSA do indeed come to work with that mentality. But I have to say, again, having looked at some different public and private operators, there's just a different edge to how they do it. We've used former private operators as consultants in our work to review and advise municipal systems on how they can achieve higher levels of performance and how they can use the best practices, noting that not all private practices are best practices, but use the best practices of some of the most efficient private operators as well as public operators. And those are the folks that say, there's just a difference when you come into a privately operated utility that they can't quite quantify, except at the bottom line. And it's very hard to maintain that high level of attention. And so what happens is over time, those internal improvements are at risk, not all of them, but those internal improvements are at risk of slippage. There is a client, for example, who we've advised for a number of years, who was subjected to a privatization threat, and indeed that's why they hired us, to keep them from being privatized. And so we brought in our folks and our experts, and we helped them through this process. And for a while, they were terrific. They were saving lots of money. They were dramatically improving their environmental compliance records. There was a new culture that had taken hold. But over time, now into the 5th or 6th year of it, Somehow the business plan isn't as detailed as it used to be, the annual business plan. The performance measures aren't used as often. The rigorous process established for asset management just takes too much time. And the inputs into the maintenance management system, well, it's just a lot easier to go back to a more basic level where you're not using the full capacity of the system. Those things happen. It's human nature. And when we do internal improvement, we recommend it. We want to try to do everything to make sure that backsliding doesn't happen. But it is a risk. There are, of course, cities out there that decide that, the internal improvement is just a heck of a lot of work, and we would like to get to a different level a little more quickly or through different means. And so they decide to contract out their operations and maintenance. There are some pretty good systems out there that have done that with pretty good success. I'll cite one, and that was the city of Milwaukee, which I probably mentioned before, where they outsourced their operations and maintenance. Now, the city of Milwaukee was quite different. The Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District was quite different than PWSA. For one thing, it was an operating entity. It treated sewage. It also produced Milorganite. I think for anybody who has plays on golf courses around here, you might be familiar with the bags of that stuff. It all comes out of Milwaukee, and it all comes from the waste generated from wastewater treatment. It's very good stuff, I can assure you. But they decided they had an operation that actually had won national awards. The staff were fairly well qualified. When we did a review of the operations, we actually couldn't find a whole lot wrong with it, other than we thought it was expensive. But Milwaukee decided that it was going to outsource that, and they did. And there had a number of large national firms competing. The staff declined to compete. And when they did, they achieved operations and maintenance savings, on I believe it was a total of a $300 million budget of 35%, which allowed them to lower sewer rates by 17.5%. I use that as an example, and one of the more successful examples, because Milwaukee has continued to renew that contract or rebid it, and they still stay with private operators, and the employees became employees of the operating company. Their pay and benefits did not diminish. In fact, actually, once liberated from municipal pay scales, the compensation went up for most of the skilled labor. And also, actually, take the back, it also went up for the lower skilled labor because they had excessive turnover among the lower skilled staff. And the turnover is very, very costly, and that was rectified as a part of the outsourcing of operations and maintenance. Okay. I want you to note either here that it is not the same as the Veolia contract. That was a short-term management contract, and the compensation structure for that contract was based on savings, which is not exactly, in fact, it wasn't all what PWSA needed. So if you consider that option, please remember that it's not like the Veolia contract. The next option is the infrastructure-only lease. In this particular case, the PWSA board remains in place. The assets remain publicly owned. The operations remain publicly operated. The maintenance, particularly the routine maintenance and minor repairs, remains public. But what is the partnership involves the capital improvement program, which means that the city would set goals for the infrastructure improvements over time. It would seek plans for those infrastructure improvements and then seek a time-certain schedule for those improvements and a price-certain schedule for those improvements. The advantage of this structure is that it removes a great deal of the uncertainty. You know the infrastructure is going to get built and when it's going to get built and how much it's going to cost. Private entity takes the risk that it will be able to deliver those facilities at a certain, deliver and maintain the assets at at a fixed annual cost over time. The compensation is not the rate control, it remains with the public side. The partner is compensated with an availability payment, which says essentially, if you make this structure available, if you make these improvements available on a time certain and functioning according to these performance standards, and only if you do that, we will pay you an annual payment from the utility budget. They do not have control over rates. What this does is it gives the utility a long-term assurance about what its capital costs are going to be. It gives a performance guarantee. It gives the public assurance that those facilities, including green infrastructure, will be put into place, what will be put into place, and when they will go in. Given the tremendous needs of PWSA, that kind of assurance can be very valuable. And indeed, the techniques that private entities, private infrastructure providers can use under this structure involve a number of different innovative procurement processes and advantages that are simply not available on the municipal side. We have seen these processes result in overall capital improvement program savings ranging from as little as 20% up to as much as 30% or more. It comes from essentially having one-stop shopping for the design, building, contracting, sharing the risks among the contractors, living with fixed price contracts from your construction contractors, very little allowance for change orders, and a long-term financial interest in the proper management of those assets. It all generally leads to a lower life cycle cost for those facilities. Now, if you were going through that process, we would not recommend that you simply take the word of these private entities that that's what they're going to do, that that's the best value. And in fact, one of the things that we employ whenever we are looking at these types of things is called a public sector comparator. And that's to look at the capital, for what we reasonably believe the capital improvement program would look like if it were done through traditional methods, allowing for risks and looking where risks fall, and then seeing how that compares to the proposals being made. That assures the city that the decision being made is cost effective. If the public sector comparator shows that there's only about a 5-7% savings, it's not worth it. But if it shows larger savings, and there's a belief that those savings could be tremendously beneficial to the ratepayers of PWSA, then that is certainly an option to consider. This option can also include the payment of an upfront payment, which is not unusual for these types of structures, both full concession and infrastructure commissions. There's an upfront payment of some kind. That payment could be quite large if you wanted it to be large. But if you're going to set up something, let's say you were going to set up a trust fund, and let's say that trust fund was going to be $50 to $100 million, the full proceeds of the upfront payment from the lessee. That trust fund could be used to permanently offset and provide assistance to low-income households as rates continue to rise dramatically over the years. That trust fund would not go away. The income from it would be a strong source of revenue, dedicated source of revenue for those low-income households. In addition, the proceeds could conceivably be used for residential lead line replacement, for assistance in residential lead line replacement. Among the advantages is that green infrastructure can be programmed into the long-term lease agreement with the entity. Remember here that rate setting, ownership of the infrastructure, operations, and routine maintenance, customer service, and responsiveness still remains the responsibility of the public entity, of the public side. There is a joint asset management committee that is established, and that joint asset management committee sees to it that there is a high level of cooperation between the public side, between the operations and maintenance side, and the infrastructure side. The next to the last option here is the full service lease concession. It's similar to the infrastructure-only lease. But you can see that if you go back and compare, the gray area shows the area that the private entity controls or is responsible for, let's say. And you can see that's relatively limited. In the full service lease, the gray area is much larger. Now, rate setting and ownership of the assets is still in public hands. The lease agreement includes performance standards, relatively strict performance standards. Rates are established by formula or prearranged agreement. Of course, this is a long-term lease. And the formulas essentially are simply designed to ensure that ratepayers get a fair shake, that rates are as low as reasonably possible, and established under a competitive process. And as I said, we would also employ a public sector comparator in this model as well. And again, you see the opportunity for upfront payments. Now, I want to say the lease payment in this case varies from the lease payment in the infrastructure-only option. In the infrastructure-only option, the private entity is paid an availability payment based upon the availability and quality of the infrastructure provided. In this scenario, the payment is actually very much rate-based, which means rates, the income flows through the PWSA into the private entity, but it's set according to a formula. The private entity cannot raise rates other than what's allowed in the formula, and ultimately that formula is established by the public side.
Steve, can you give us examples of concessionaires, what that looks like, who might be that, what that entity might be?
They would generally be, there are a number of domestic private operators, but in terms of those capable of actually employing that much capital, you're talking about an entity capable of being able to responsibly implement a $4 billion capital improvement program, in addition to the operations. There aren't that many entities that are capable of doing that. I would say globally there are about, those are who are focused on the U.S. market, some of which are American, some of which are international. I'd say there were about 7 or 8 firms that I know of that would be interested and capable of executing this type of arrangement. This is the type of arrangement that was used in not Allentown.
Scranton?
Not Scranton. Scranton was a transfer to a investor-owned utility. Not just Allentown, and what's the other city in the U.S. that used, in Pennsylvania that used that model?
Middleton.
Middletown. The difference here is that they were taking money out of the utility to use for general fund or pension purposes. Personally, I don't like that. If all you're doing is trying to cash out on ratepayers, then that's not the right thing to do. And that's certainly not the objective for the city of Pittsburgh here. Effectively, when those towns, and Bayonne, New Jersey is another one, when they executed this type of structure, they did so primarily, though not entirely, primarily to provide money for their general fund. And I think that's always gets you into trouble.
Sort of what the city did when it created PWSA.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
Was not the Immaculate Conception.
The last option we reviewed was the transfer to a regulated Pennsylvania investor-owned utility. Locally, that can include your electric or your gas utility or some other companies. Also, it can include the private water companies that have a lot of cities under their jurisdiction. Again, the trust fund, the proceeds from the sale, if you will, the sale could be for zero. I mean, the system has a lot of needs in it. So the sale could be for zero, but the sale proceeds could be 50 million, 100 million, whatever. But since the city doesn't want to take any money out of this deal for the general fund, those upfront payment can be used to set up a trust fund of the type that I described earlier, permanent trust fund. You see here that the primary regulatory mechanism is the State Public Utilities Commission, and there it also includes a local citizens advisory committee, which communicates with the PUC in a fairly well-established manner. You can see the service economies there. Now, this is a good time to point out that one of the things that we did was we modeled the rate increases that we thought could occur under each of these scenarios, starting with the baseline, proceeding through the internal improvement, and then on to the various options. There were a number of variables in that analysis, logical variables, that I think you can understand. In cases where the existing tax-exempt debt was defeased, that obviously was a high upfront cost. And so we included those costs in the model. And by the way, in all scenarios, we assumed that the non-revenue water primarily to nonprofit entities was recovered by PWSA, and that resulted in about a 7% increase in revenue over the current system for all scenarios. We also took into account the structure of the financing. The options, each of these options has a somewhat different financial structure. In some cases, the cost of capital is higher. There's one scenario for the infrastructure-only option, for example, where it continues to be funded with tax-exempt debt. Essentially, you have in that example, and I won't go into detail because it is complicated, you have a senior tranche of tax-exempt debt, which is relatively low cost, and then you have a subordinated tranche of tax-exempt debt, which is at a higher rate, and the private entity investors buy that subordinated debt, in effect acting as equity. But that's their income. It's not going to be a lot of income, but it's going to be steady and predictable. And that steadiness and the predictability of the revenues is why PWSA is likely to be able to do whatever it does in its restructuring at a fairly cost-effective rate, in the sense that that you're looking at nothing like the type of returns that private equity would seek on its equity portion, or let alone venture capital. This is a much steadier, much more predictable, much safer investment, which is one of the reasons why some of the folks out there who are looking very seriously at Pittsburgh, and specifically at Pittsburgh, include union pension funds, who are looking to put their funds into a predictable, reliable source of revenue, and they have sufficient, and in this case, they have sufficient confidence in the private entity that they are willing to invest their union members' money in this asset.
So where does the spread on the return come from for the investors? For the variance between the operating costs from a publicly regulated utility versus,
Depends on the structure. If it's the full service lease, then yeah, that's where the variance comes from. If it's the infrastructure only, then no, you're not relying on operating savings. You're relying on capital program efficiencies. And as I said, that margin is not very high. I mean, we're talking about the subordinate debt being at a fairly far down the ladder single-digit rate. But it's the kind of returns pension funds want. They want it safe, they want it long, and they'll settle for a lower percentage. Now back to the revenue, to the ratepayer impact analysis. Generally speaking, the mid-level term rates household rates were in the $500 per month range for all of the scenarios. It is roughly comparable to PWSA's current forecast of around $460 per household. Now, remember what we did? We took the revenue requirement and divided it by about 80,000 because that was the right denominator to use. And so there was some significant variance. And I won't go into those now, and we can sit down and talk about those numbers at some point. Suffice to say that the infrastructure-only scenario, the full concession scenario, the infrastructure-only concession had lower rates than the baseline or the internal improvement option. It was a close call on the infrastructure on the full service infrastructure, largely because they would have to defease the existing debt and replace it with taxable financing. That was the primary driver. You've got to be pretty efficient to be able to offset that cost. And we assumed some fairly basic efficiencies there, but nothing dramatic. The only place where we saw an earth-shaking difference in rates, projected rates, was on this scenario. And it's fairly simple to understand in that if you take the $4 billion in capital improvements and you divide it by a much larger number of customers, you get a lower number. You don't get the full effect because a lot of the cost is sewer and stormwater, and that you can't spread those costs around through water customers. But there were significant economies there. And so our conclusion was that this scenario would actually offer the lowest rates, and demonstrably so, compared to all of the other options.
Can you explain that a little bit more in terms of why? I mean, is it because you can spread the cost across more customers than just the 80,000 PWSA?
Right.
And that's not available for the other options? Is that
Right. That's really not available for the other options. And again, that's an option. That's only if you go with a water company. If it's a gas company or a power company, they have other efficiencies, and indeed they have efficiencies that the water companies don't have. Customer service, for example, main replacement, repair, all of those things have, other utilities have very strong efficiencies in that regard. But it's simply the size of the rate base. Now, will the PUC allow this to spread this cost around the rest of the state? Well, they do have a statewide rate, and our understanding in looking into this is that there's nothing that would keep that state rate from prevailing, and therefore spreading those costs out over the state. But that's kind of an unprecedented thing to say that, okay, we're going to allow $4 billion of costs to be spread out over the entire statewide rate base for the company. So we can't say definitively that that's what would happen. But it does make a big difference in rates. Okay, now we get down to the brass tacks here. When we're evaluating the options, here are some possible criteria, which I've shared with you before. And indeed, they reflect a lot of the values here that you see on the board that we collected from our public input over the web and at the public meeting. This checkbox is simply to say that they can be, maybe they should be part of your consideration, and that starting with ratepayer impact, of course, but also including accountability, performance improvement guarantees to be absolutely certain, contractually certain, or not contractually certain, that the performance is going to improve, that the facilities are going to be delivered, the improvements are going to be made, the green infrastructure is going to be employed, et cetera. We include labor impacts, of course. Low-income household protection is a very important part of this, that every big city in the country is going to be struggling with, and PWSA is only beginning to deal with that issue. The legal and financial feasibility of the alternatives. I think the legal analysis we did establish that all of these are legally feasible. The ease and speed of implementation, you don't want to get hung up or have a slow process here. And finally, the durability of the change, which is very important.
Steve, before you go on.
Yeah.
So I had a question for Christine that I thought I would save to the end, but since it bears so directly on this, I think I have to ask it now. I was surprised that health and safety was fourth on the list. Could you give us some insight into that? And Steve, where I'm going with this is, it's also not on this list at all.
I'm sorry, what was that?
Health and safety are not on this list at all, except I could imagine environmental protection and compliance, you could say, is related to that. But then I glanced ahead, and on the next table, the environmental compliance doesn't even show up. So
That's
time-
just because we were consolidating rows. I mean, we just were
But there's
running out of
not-
space on the slide. No, it's certainly,
No,
I'm
no.
seriously, Jerry, there was not an intention to leave any of those off.
Okay, but I'm just, so you got a table here
Okay.
where the words environment, safety, and health don't appear anywhere. And that's a surprise. So let me back up. Why, Christine, was it so low on the list? In your estimation?
Yeah, I think that the lead issue is well documented and is definitely, from my anecdotal conversations, lead is definitely a big issue. I think that if you wanted to lump green infrastructure in as a way of dealing with health and safety, specifically of water quality,
Really?
No, I'm not trying to put that in there, but I think that there are a couple big issues. One is lead, and then one is water quality that come up. But
Right, so
Yeah.
why is it fourth on the list? That's what I'm.
It's not in any particular order. None of these things are in any particular order.
No, I'm sorry, Steve.
On the ranking.
Sorry.
On the
that
ranking.
came
So
from the public
the
meeting.
first question for Christine goes
Yeah.
back to her bar chart,
Oh, I see.
yeah.
where it was fourth. It
Okay.
has nothing to do with your table.
I'm not sure. To be honest, I'm not sure.
That
So
was
you
the
didn't get
outcome of
any-
the public
That's the
meeting.
outcome
No,
of the
I know,
meeting, yeah.
but you talked more to the
Right,
public than we did.
Yeah.
Okay, so maybe the public will inform us
Right,
later
right,
why
yeah.
It just looks
it's so
like
low.
cost seems to trump. Just looking at it, seems to be more important than health and safety.
Well, she had a bar chart that showed accountability was number one, which I get,
Right,
and everything flows from accountability. But
right.
it's just, the number one mission is to provide safe water to preserve the public health and
Yep.
safety. So that was fourth on your list is a surprise, and that you don't have any insight, that's understandable.
I don't, yeah, I don't
Okay,
know.
but
No,
then-
sorry.
If nothing else but for form's sake, I would have expected health and safety to be on this list, and certainly environment, public health, or safety to be on the next
I
table.
understand. There
Okay.
was no, we tried to consolidate categories, and these are just suggestions on criteria. These aren't ours. These are suggestions that the panel is absolutely free to choose among those as to which ones that it wants to be considered in its evaluation.
Thank you.
We want to point out here the driving factors behind the recommendation that we're about to make. We first attended to the public's desire to keep the ownership and operations in public hands. Certainly, at least for the folks who attended the public meetings, that seemed to be a priority. I think it also reflects the consensus of the city, that they would like to do that if it's possible. The importance of making governance fully independent of partisan political influence is a driving factor. The Auditor General's report simply confirmed our belief that that was important. We also thought the need for immediate, unrestricted redress of PWSA's operating problems was very important in light of the EPA, DEP findings and their recent investigation, and the likelihood, the possibility, if not likelihood, that the state would impose PUC regulation not just for rates, but for performance. And receivership legislation having been introduced, again, which would take the facility completely out of control of the city. We've been through that before. We've served as an agent of the special master whenever in various receiverships, meaning that we were the advisor on telling them how to run their utilities when it was under court control. And I can tell you that once it's under court control, you can't even, the saying goes, you can't pick up a pencil and sharpen it without approval from the judge. The importance, the desire to keep, we also paid attention to the desire to keep household ratepayer impacts from the infrastructure repair costs and the CSO solution as low as possible. You literally can go dollar to dollar to see the impact of a higher cost on household rates. It's direct. We also realize the importance to regulators and ratepayers of contractually binding commitments to address infrastructure failures in a time-certain fashion now and in the future. Now, some people may say, well, gee, that's not important. What's really important to us is keeping the infrastructure publicly owned. But for the regulators out there who really don't care whether it's public or private, whether it's leased or whether it's owned by somebody else, they care about those improvements, those corrections being made on a time-certain, performance-certain basis. And that's why we included that here. The desire to create a large, permanent, irrevocable trust fund to assist low-income households with large and imminent rate increases. Now, there are several different strategies for assisting low-income households, some of which are under some legal challenge, actually, the notion that you can't have two classes of customers. And some attempts have not survived court challenge in that regard. So it's always a delicate process to do that. And it begs for a permanent solution because this is a permanent problem. Low-income households 20 years from now, 30 years from now, are still going to be low income. And higher water and sewer rates, substantially higher in water and sewer rates, are still 20 to 30 years from now going to affect them disproportionately. This is a problem that begs for a permanent solution. And so creating a trust fund that can be accessed in that way was an important part of our consideration in making a recommendation. And finally, a desire to codify Pittsburgh's green infrastructure commitment into a long-term binding contract. Now, whether that's a contract between the city and the board and PWSA, or between the city and the trust, or it's embedded in a trust charter agreement, or it's in a contract or a lease agreement that says fairly specifically, this is what you have to do with regard to green infrastructure. And in fact, that's the default mode. So if you can't do green infrastructure in these circumstances, or you say it's not cost effective, you have to prove why, for example, to have a variance over the mandate. So all of these things were factors that drove our recommendation, which is this. I mentioned before that we recommend that the city create a new independent public water trust, that it appoint a new board of trustees, which later appoints directors. The PWSA, instead of being placed in a receivership by some environmental-driven party or politically-driven party and allow them to dictate the terms, to find a form of receivership which liberates PWSA from the constraints that it currently operates in and to protect it from political interference while the other processes are going on, while the assets are being transferred to the trust, while other pieces of the improvement initiative are going on. We expect that PWSA's current management would not change, and in fact, they would be a participant in this, an active participant in this process, and would enjoy the benefits of being protected from the barriers that have previously limited their ability to improve PWSA. To transfer operations to issue an RFP for an infrastructure-only lease that would preserve public ownership of the system, public operation of the system, public maintenance of the system, public governance of the system, and on top of that, PUC regulation of the process. To transfer assets to the public trust with the conditions mentioned earlier. To transfer operations to the public trust when it's ready, and to dissolve the PWSA board. To execute a long-term infrastructure-only lease with the conditions that we discussed earlier, and to place the trust activities of the independent public trust under the jurisdiction of the state PUC. This is the structure graphically shown for the lease agreement, PUC regulation, and the trust. And you can visually see, it's a bit complicated, but you can visually see the connections between the different components of this structure, of this recommended structure. The conditions of the transfer to the trust and to the infrastructure lessee would include a public accountability vehicle which supplements the Board of Trustees, a PUC rate and customer service regulation. The PUC actually gets involved in more than rate regulation. It also gets involved in service quality. The performance improvement targets become guarantees. They become codified in both agreements. Green infrastructure goals are guaranteed. Labor protection is guaranteed. Low-income household protection trust fund is established and guaranteed. And the residential lead line replacement assistance can be, we recommend that it be part of the mandate of the permanent public assistance trust. The timeline here shows that our recommendations can be implemented essentially in 2 phases. The first is between now and the end of the year, and that is to create the shell of the trust, to appoint its initial board of directors, to place PWSA's operations into a receivership of the city's own design, and to establish conditions for eventual transfer of the assets. Beginning in January, the city would issue a broad RFP for an infrastructure-only lease concession. When those proposals are in, that would be compared to the public sector comparator, shared with the city council, or shared with the trustees and the key decision makers, and then they would decide whether that was in the best interest of the public. Transfer the operations and assets to the trust. The trustees select the infrastructure improvement lease proposal from those that are submitted, and I can tell you in advance that there is extraordinary worldwide interest in this. Why do I say worldwide? Because billions and billions have been raised either in pension funds, by pension fund managers working on behalf of pension funds, and by other types of funds around the world targeting water infrastructure. And again, these are not robber barons looking for high teens returns. These are folks looking for a place to park pension money, predictably and safely. There is a great deal of interest in that. And so we believe that when the city does solicit proposals, they will be a large number, it will be innovative, and they will tell the city a lot about whether this is a good idea or not. Once the operations have been transferred to the trust and an infrastructure partner has been selected to create an important joint asset management committee, which would oversee the long-term maintenance of the assets, major repairs and replacements, system upgrades, and finally to place once all of that is complete, to place the new public trust under Pennsylvania State Public Utility Commission jurisdiction. Last slide. Going forward, we would have the deliberations by the panel, the mayor, and the council with regard to our recommendations, and of course you're free to come up with your own. If this is the path that's chosen, to develop the public trust documents. Creating the shell is not terribly difficult. Filling it is more difficult. Determine the form of temporary receivership of a type that the city could control, one that would satisfy the folks barking at the door and liberating the utility to function in a manner sufficient to deal with the emergency issues, and to assure the community that while this process is going on, that something very, very big and important is being done. To codify the conditions of the asset transfer to the trust, identify other salient elements of the asset and operations transfer, and to refine the implementation plans and the schedule. All of those are the steps that could be coming up in the next few months. All of which will hopefully yield to the public, to the city of Pittsburgh, a better future for Pittsburgh's water. And so with all these options and all this phenomenal amount of information, good luck, and I'm open to your questions.
Before we open to questions, if I can ask that this report today be posted to the website if it's not already. And what is that website for the public? So pwsablueribbon.com? Okay, pwsablueribbon.com. So the presentation today will be fully available to the public as soon as possible. Thank you. Questions or discussion from the panel?
Please. Just a question, or maybe I missed this. So when you do this scenario, if this is the scenario that plays out, what happens to rates?
Microphone, a little closer. That's okay.
I'm sorry.
Well, for the time being, nothing. I mean, the 28% rate increase just went through, so
But like, say, 10 years from now?
10 years from now, it depends on the scenario, but in the rate setting doesn't change. The only scenario in which rate setting changes or shifts to a PUC is under the sale to a private utility.
I guess maybe I'm not asking it right. So if we recommend this plan, the city decides to take the plan with the leasing of the concessionaire for the assets.
Right.
In 10 years, what do the rates look like in the PWSA? Because I heard you say you did some modeling of what rates would look
We
like.
did model it, and we found that they would be somewhat lower than the projections for the internal improvement option.
And what were the projections for the internal improvement option?
They were, I'd have to go back and look at the numbers. Actually,
I
we
thought you
didn't.
said something like 400 and something.
That was the assumption we were given from the numbers we were given translate to that based on the city's analysis done, or excuse me, PWSA's analysis done by Raftelis and Associates. It's not exactly the same, but we used the same information.
Okay. And that was like, and that rate change is how much versus today? Is it?
You know,
Forget, we don't know.
it was a lot more than today, and we have. I was hesitant to get into that discussion because the key variable there, and this is something that's better done when we have more time to go specifically into this issue, is that there are a number of assumptions regarding efficiencies and changes in efficiencies that are based on the available research that we have on public operation, private operation, you know.
If I can say that there will be a forthcoming report.
Yes.
That is due. And so
that's-
today's presentation
Got it.
is the presentation of options. I think part of your scope of work is to actually produce a report.
Exactly.
That shows the numbers, the assumptions that went in there, so that ultimately the panel, in forming
that.
its own
Right.
comments
I
and
wanted to tell you that we-
recommendations. Can I finish?
Sure, of course.
Comments and recommendations can then come back based upon that report. So today was sort of presenting a summary of the findings. There's clearly more work to be done, including diving into the details, not only to confirm some of the assumptions that went into the recommendations, but also, if, whatever further questions or concerns from the panel or the public, there'll be a process by which we can make that part of the final recommendation.
Sure.
Steve,
Could
may I
I
ask-
raise a question? I'm totally confused at this point. We had a conversation earlier where you said our end goal is to try to create some type of regional solution, and you built that into the model.
Yes.
As I look through these documents, conditions of the transfer, recommendations, overall approach, summary table notes, the driving factors behind the recommendations, none of this documentation suggests anything about regionalization.
It's true. Regionalization was a topic that we were introduced to relatively late in the process, but we felt that our focus had to be on PWSA.
I understand it, but I asked you earlier in the session, wasn't that our end goal? And you said most assuredly it was. Now- So my question,
That's a fair question.
my question then becomes, and I said, well, you're going to incorporate that into the future stuff, and you said, yes, we will. So my question then becomes, if this is a late addition, the idea that what we're really trying to do is to make PWSA attractive for regional solutions, then does that reframe the options that you've suggested? Let me give you an example. So let's say that we wanted to say we want to enter into a 10-year program. And at the end of the 10-year program, we'll do the trust agreement that you mentioned with a sunset of 10 years. And that at our end goal at the end of those 10 years would then be to be working on some type of more regionalized solution. If that was what we were really trying to do, wouldn't that affect your
If I can weigh
options
in,
and your
David,
outcomes?
obviously, the solutions presented here are not going to solve regionalization. We have a county that has 130 municipalities, 47 school districts. Alcosan is made up of 84 customer municipality water systems. So I don't
Well,
think.
no,
Let me finish. I think if let me.
I'm not
No, I
arguing.
think that clearly solving the critical phase of where we are right now, it should not preclude conversations about how we regionalize, how we handle water and sewer systems in the city and in the region. I wouldn't expect, though, that would be
Exactly.
solved simply
Exactly.
by a reorganization of just PWSA itself. Whether or not a reorganized PWSA becomes a platform by which we could merge with and integrate with surrounding community water systems, absolutely. Let's have that conversation. And if this creates a stronger system that further leads to conversations about regionalization, I think that's a very valid point. Clearly, right now, we're at risk of losing this asset. And if we don't take, some of the critical phases,
would
you
it
can
not be
foreclose the
appropriate-
conversation about any regionalization.
Would it then not be appropriate, under the conditions to transfer the trust to the infrastructure lease, to so indicate that the idea that that's where we would want to go?
One of the conditions
would
on
be
the
included.
I would presume that one of the conditions on the trust instrument could be to provide for a path toward a regional solution to this. I'd love a regional solution on debt structure of the city, on pension. The fact that, our city doubles in size every day from commuters that don't pay taxes to the city. On top of that, I think that we could empower this trust to pursue those options in Harrisburg, which is where the solution lies.
So the only thing I'm arguing is that should then be part of the framing document.
Well said.
So that we modify the factors driving some of the presentation that you made at the end to also reflect that these are also one of the outcomes.
Agreed.
So that was one issue. Then my bigger issue is, if that's really what we're trying to do.
David, let me. I'm sorry to stop the logic here on that. Regionalization is something that I favor because I favor good government, and I favor efficient government, and I personally favor that. However, it would be a lot of hubris for me to say, therefore, I as a consultant have decided that regionalization is the best thing to do and it's going to happen, and I'm going to make that as a recommendation in this case.
We've decided that. You are walking into a process that has been going on for years and years and years, where we are trying to build the relationships between the city, the other municipalities, other institutions in a way that's going to address our stormwater issues, our dirty water issues, and our clean water issues. So that's where we want to go. I think it's not you telling us that's where we want to go. It's arguably where we've said we know that we have to go. And to articulate that into the document, I think it's important to say that, because there has to be a clear message, and we do not want to be in a position where we created a perpetual trust that 10 years from now all of a sudden becomes a huge obstacle in our way to be able to then seek out a regionalized solution. So we can prevent that now if that's what we articulate.
Right.
And I also point out that we are in the part of a 3-year, 4-year, 5-year effort just to try to transfer the multi-municipal sewer pipes from the city of Pittsburgh to Alcoasand, so that we can relieve the city of the responsibility for those upgrades. And we're struggling to get an agreement to do that. So, the idea that we're going to move forward with some type of, of governance agreement in light of all the other work that we've been doing, I think should be put in context.
On behalf of the administration, I would fully agree that all the work that's been done by the IOP and Connect and the other organizations to provide for a regional solution to this could be definitely baked into the implementation structure of whatever recommendation comes out of this. And this would be exactly the type of feedback from the panel that I would expect based upon the report. So very well said, and I fully agree.
Steve, did you have an opportunity to interview Alcoasand during this process?
Yes.
And any feedback that you can share with us in terms of?
The impression I got was they really don't want to have anything to do with this system.
My other question under conditions of the transfer.
Well, I mean, understand their concern. I think they would very, very much like to see PWSA right its ship. I think that's very important to them as a functioning entity and as a partner in this process. However, in response, I think if I were to ask them the question of, do you have any interest in taking over the sewer system and all the accompanying liabilities? Do you have any interest in taking over the entire system and all the accompanying liabilities?
They didn't pay the bill, I guess.
Okay. Then I think that their answer, acting in their fiduciary responsibility, is no.
under the conditions of the transfer to the trust, the last thing, residential lead line replacement assistance. Do you have any further information about assistance? Is it related to zero loan or no interest loan structure, or
It could
is
be
it
gra- it could be gra- it
subsidy,
could
or
be,
is it grants,
grants
or
and
is
subsidy.
it, what does it,
It could be anything.
so it's
that
not
the-
defined, it's
Right.
just
It could be anything that the
partial
city or the
versus full
trust.
line replacement? I mean,
Well, the city would be essentially writing the charter for the creation of this fund, whether it was then, later embedded into the trust founding documents or whether it was made separately. So they would be able to decide whether first of all, whether the trust was large enough in terms of income to be able to sustain itself and generate grants. I would suspect that it would be grants. I think loaning low-income households money when it can be that large doesn't necessarily solve the problem.
Other questions or discussion from the panel? Alex?
Steve, could you talk a little bit about receivership? It was a little out of the blue. So really, the two parts that you could maybe expand on is, one, you referenced the fear that suddenly the DEP, EPA may come in and take some type of action. One, is that based on actual discussions?
Yes.
And two, what legal authority would the DEP or the EPA have to do that? So maybe that first, and then follow on that, what you would envision the receivership would look like.
So I can answer the question. There is a pending bill in Harrisburg that I believe Representative Costa had introduced last week or the week prior that would form almost like an Act 47-like receivership for PWSA. And so whether or not that has legislative legs, we've not had conversations with the representative or anybody, but clearly there is a will in Harrisburg to do something. Obviously, there is a bill pending as well to introduce PUC oversight to PWSA, but this would take it further. In effect, remove our ability as a board at PWSA or as a city, as the owner of the asset, to make decisions about the future. That would be an imposition of it's a undefined legislation at this point, but it would be sort of an Act 47-like oversight board that would presumably control the budget, the material decisions, above and beyond the typical regulation that you'd expect from PUC, which is more from a consumer protection, perspective. So there's clearly conversations in Harrisburg underway. Whether or not that comes to fruition, I would say that similarly, this introduction of a trust concept came out of some of the recommendations of the Auditor General's report to depoliticize the relationship. I can tell you that the board and the sort of the comparisons with the city were with regard to things that you, I think, were concerned about when you were board chair. The fact that we have a residency requirement, the fact that we sort of still track the salaries of PWSA tagged towards the city, even though we've been unaffiliated legally for over 20 years. Those kinds of things are still in effect right now. And so this was one idea that came out of this conversation about a way for us to depoliticize the operations of this organization, but yet hold it publicly owned and publicly accountable.
And the receivership structure actually came out of not even separately from the legislation that's been introduced, but from several sources. We've heard that DEP and EPA were seriously considering a very aggressive action of the type that would place the utility under a court's control. And we've been through several of those processes as an advisor, and it's one that's very frustrating if you're the owner of the assets.
I think
Right.
also
and that maybe a little bit is my concern. That's maybe you could explain, having been involved with receiverships, it's not something you would voluntarily elect to do, right? It usually involves a significant amount of expense related to the receiver, as well as a loss of control. And so as a optimal solution, as a recommendation, what I was trying to understand is what's the benefit of that as opposed to what we could do, right? Which is legislatively fight this bill, or if somebody else tries to take an action, the EPA or the EB resist that action because we have a plan for fixing PWSA.
I would say there are two issues that were, I at least initially hearing this, would consider as relevant to moving forward with a trust-like type of independent document or organization. One is that it would avoid, in effect, a state takeover. I mean, the idea that we could then say, look, we are creating a structure with legally enforceable conditions accountable to a court to make the changes we need to see happen to this authority or this asset in the system. Thereby, we don't need Act 47 like superior powers sort of looking over our shoulder, sort of keep it locally controlled through a trust structure. Secondly, mayors change. The political structure is good when you have somebody in office who is fighting for green infrastructure, who does want to depoliticize it, doesn't want to hire, political friends in no-show jobs at authorities, doesn't want to hijack the budgets of these authorities, months before an election, which we've seen happen in the past. I think if you track the expenditures here, they track political cycles. So again, this is a 50-year problem. We're creating right now at this moment in time a 50-year solution. Do we want that accountability to be held on 4-year cycles? And I think as somebody here, this would be the mayor giving up power. This would be the mayor giving up the ability to appoint the board members and really putting it into a public trust, accountable to a court and to the public without the involvement of politics. I think a conversation with our solicitor who's with us today, we have an ethics commission here in the city who we've created under her leadership. She's here with us, Lourdes Sanchez-Ridge, that has a board that is made up of specified stakeholders, all of whom have extraordinary powers under the city to investigate things that happen and to keep us all accountable. That is perhaps a model that we've already worked through to create that independent body that has accountability to the public, but also independence from the political structure.
Thanks. And I am 100% in agreement, and I like the recommendation on the trust or some type of independence there. It was just a receivership that kind of threw me a little bit for a loop, just based on, as I said, the administrator. Yeah.
I have one important clarification, very important clarification to make on the recommendation for an infrastructure-only lease concession, and that is that it would be accompanied by an assisted internal improvement on the operations, regular maintenance, and governance side. All of the items that we proposed here, all of these components would also be part of the infrastructure-only concession option.
But done internally.
Yes, exactly.
Could you flesh that out a little bit? Because it sounds like we're going to have let me put it in layman's terms, right? We're going to hire somebody to spend and properly implement our capital improvement plan.
Yes.
So the $2 billion in the water side and the $1 billion on the sewer side, we're going to hire somebody to design, plan, and execute on that investment on the system, and they would be paid typically how?
On an availability payment basis, which means where you establish a payment, and that payment varies according to performance. It can even go to zero if they default. But the payment varies according to their performance. If the facilities are delivered according to standards of high quality and on time, whether they're on budget is not a problem for you because their availability payment is already established. It has to function, it has to be maintained properly. It applies to capital construction projects, it applies to major repairs, it applies to anything that could broadly be called asset management, which is separated from routine maintenance. Now, we'd have to make a decision as to whether it's more efficient to integrate the routine maintenance in with the larger repair and replacement cycle. But that's a decision that can be made. And remember, Tier 2, you don't just suddenly decide we have made a decision to engage someone to do all of this. That decision would not get made until after the proposals are received and after there is a comparison with the baseline public projection using the public sector comparator.
And those availability payments would come out of revenues of
Yes.
the...
Availability payments are actually a very well accepted method for financing infrastructure all over the world. And because we have a Dutch affiliate that's all over the world, there's a lot of practice in those availability payment structures. And investors really like those and the reason they do is because they can't get a high return. They just know that as long as their developer operator performs, it's a low but consistent return.
Still, the entity would have to be able to generate enough revenue to make those payments.
No, the entity doesn't generate revenue. You mean the public side?
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
But in part, it helps
And
the
that's
public entity because
rates.
they know you say the capital
No,
side.
I get it, yeah. No, I get it. There's no free lunch, that's the...
Of course.
Are there existing water sewer, municipalities that have entered into these type of arrangements in the United States?
They've entered into concession agreements. There are a large number in the U.S. and around the world that have entered into long-term concession agreements for water and sewer facilities. Typically, they include operations. However, there's no reason that they have to include operations. And that's why we made this recommendation, because we felt it was important that the operations and customer service side remain public.
Yeah, one of the things that would be helpful, and I'm not on the blue ribbon panel, let me be clear, but I'm advising them. So that I think would be helpful to me is to see a couple of those case studies.
Sure.
I'd like, we're talking not a concession agreement for 200 million, 300 million. We're talking a concession agreement for billions, and I'd like to see it, what it exists now, and
Sure.
think a little bit about the scalability.
Absolutely.
Right? So-
We'll do that.
Yeah, and to just add on to that a little bit, I'd like to see some that have been around I assume there's some been around for 10, 20, 30 years already.
Yes,
Because I'd really like to see kind of long-term how they play out.
absolutely.
Okay.
Sure.
Could I pick up on the receivership? Because as I look at your assisted internal improvement program, that would be pretty much what we call an Act 47 recovery plan. What somebody would do if they were trying to, in effect, right the ship of a failing organization. So, when you were talking earlier, Kevin, about the Act 47 process or Act 47 equivalent. How could we create, sort of, if you will, the political space that, what's to stop Bill from simply saying that's what we're going to, that's what we're going to do, and we're going to have a assisted internal improvement program / Act 47 plan. We're going to implement these things because I'm mayor and I can do that, and PWSA board supports. It seems to me that the issue that we're ultimately talking about is the weight or belief in such a process having the credibility that would actually get implemented in ways that it hasn't been done in the past. So if you say a form of receivership, if there's anything less than some type of sort of legally binding process, then I guess I'm confused in why we wouldn't want to encourage an Act 47 equivalent for utility.
Well, I think there's a number of reasons that it makes sense, one of which, obviously you have staying power beyond the political cycles, but obviously folks in the room, maintaining local control is important. And I think, having Act 47, which is accountable to folks in Harrisburg, may not be in our best interest, having just gone through that, and then the ICA, and then you play politics. So Harrisburg is just as much of a political animal as 9 members of council.
The Act 47 recovery plan had to be approved by council. So
correct.
My
boss
that was still locally approved.
Right.
And I'm not arguing
Right.
with that process at all.
Yeah. It's an option.
I'm simply saying that if what we're really struggling with is to try to find some type of legal process by which we create this honesty that the recommendations get implemented.
Right.
improvements would be made, would be generated.
To your question on, it's one form of corporate governance change to make sure that we're doing the right thing, insulated from politics. It could be a receivership like a 47. It could be the establishment of a trust like it's being recommended here. It could be a revision of the contract between the city and PWSA to embed into those the same types of protections. You can choose, and we should deliberate upon what an array of different solutions that could be achieved. I think the one of the elements of a trust is that it's publicly accountable to a court. It's legally enforceable to the instrument as a matter of law. The trustees can only do what's in the best interests of the system, and they have the fiduciary duty to do nothing other. So again, there are different models. Certainly this is not a panacea to solve all the problems that we're facing, but I do believe that, at least on behalf of the administration, investigating a new corporate governance model to depoliticize this system is something that's, and have it more publicly accountable is worthwhile our endeavor.
And what I think is really important is that what we've established is what's the problem, right? So that the problem is not that we see a way through an assisted internal improvement program that we can make immediate changes to improve all of the outcomes of PWSA. So that's,
And one of the things we heard from the stakeholders
so
is
we
that's
have
what they
in a
were
way
worried about,
one of
is this
the
interim.
solutions. We have one of the solutions right there. And I guess the issue, Kevin, as you've appropriately phrased it, what's the best way to get to that solution so that everybody feels appropriate and there's enough teeth in what we're doing such that process would go on apoliticized.
Agreed.
The public trust, have you thought about how you would incorporate a stormwater utility as part of the public trust, or is that part of the recommendations or
We actually
the
haven't
charter?
made a recommendation on what would be done with the stormwater. We do know that it would probably be established as as a separate enterprise fund with dedicated revenues going that are collected from a stormwater fee going specifically to the development and maintenance of a stormwater storage or separation assets. It's really that wasn't exactly our mission here. Certainly, it can be incorporated into the trust, and one of the things that we do think is that it is a bit odd you can have a financing mechanism that's separate for the CSO compliance. But to have an operating entity that is separate doesn't make sense. Financing vehicles get set up all the time, and they work just fine as financing vehicles. But as an operating entity responsible for the maintenance and development of an asset, that would set something I believe should be unified.
But earlier you were saying that as the public trust got set up, you could incorporate
Absolutely.
some of the things that David's talking about,
Absolutely.
all the other things. I just think that, having been a resident here all my life, I like the idea of the public trust. And it's game-changing for the city how the city is operated. But if we're going to do something like this, well, let's incorporate everything else that we want to do or wanted to do for the last 20 years, including recommendations from the Cohen Committee on regionalized sewers and so forth, and taking into consideration the other aspects that we've talked about. I don't know how much the capacity of the plant factored into some of your decisions. It's something that the city for a long time obviously has been interested in selling water and does sell water to other communities. But the plant is basically operating at 50% capacity and has the opportunity to do that. Obviously, we have challenges right now with the quality of the water and other things that we need to do for our infrastructure, but I believe that they're all solvable. And as we start to develop the trust, we ought to be thinking about that as well.
Yes, I would agree with that.
Other questions or discussion? As my allergy medicine wears off. Sorry. Okay, so I do realize we're about 2 hours and 20 minutes in, and we do have a follow-up meeting here with the panel. I want to actually, open it up to the public, those who have kind of remained through here. If there are questions for the panel or you'd like to present to Mr. Steckler and his team, if you can come up to the podium. If not, obviously, we have a mechanism through our website for public comments to be incorporated. Those are being collected. So if anybody wants to approach the microphone and say a few words. Okay. Can you? Okay. All right. So the website, the comment was for the public was made that there is no character limit to the website like there was before. Please visit. I do want to thank IMG, the team, for your work. Obviously, the members of the Blue Room panel. Just for clarity, for next steps, as we get closer to a decision, there are members of the panel, including Jen Prizzuti, our budget director, and myself, who are going to remove ourselves from the deliberations. I think from as folks who are going to be decision makers at some point, or at least assist the mayor and members of council with some of these decisions, we're really going to allow the panel to deliberate themselves along with the folks who we've invited to be their advisors. So obviously we're available for input, questions, but I think duty of candor, as well as without any appearance of conflict, and I mentioned this to you earlier, we're going to sort of remove ourselves from those deliberations. I also want to thank the members of the PWSA board who are here, the executive director and his leadership team. These are fantastic folks who work very hard. If you don't know, typically authority boards in the city meet every month. These guys are meeting every other week. The volume of work that's happening within this authority right now, they have taken on responsibility for this. I've never once heard them complain. I've never once heard them pass the buck. They clearly have stepped up and they own this situation. I don't want anybody to feel that any of the investigations underway here, any of the comments made by Steve or his team are in any way critical of the board or the executive director and his leadership team. These are some of the best public servants we have working today in city government. And again, for those who are against privatization, you have to look just to the south here. We had a private water company just the other day who had a boil order that go into effect, and I got an email from them asking, what do we do? And I said, welcome to the party. So that being said, there's a lot of hard work ahead of us, and I can't be prouder of the work that's been done by our board towards exercising their duties to the public under some very difficult circumstances. I think if you look at the work that we've done really over the last 8 months, it's been tremendous. The work that's underway, and I have to give credit to Alex Thompson and his team, who kind of walked into this from the very beginning, really learned their way, and then passed the torch to this new team who is, I think, doing great work. So we're looking to build upon that work, and all of our efforts are meant to complement the work that you do. I'd be remiss, the Heinz Endowments as well has funded some work by Howard Newkrug, which we deemed the Mayor's Innovation Project, who have met with a number of you. They've done an independent sort of analysis of PWSA, really primarily from an internal investigation there. They'll be available. I believe they're in the office tomorrow. I have a meeting with them to make their work available to all of you. So I see Matt Barron, who's here with us today from the Heinz Endowments, who has been committed to that process. Howard was previously involved in the Philadelphia Water Authority, I believe, and has a number of other thoughts that we feel is important to be part of your decision making and ultimately the recommendations that come back. So with that, if there anybody else, yes.
With PWSA right now in anticipation of a bond issue to refinance debt to save money, which I think everybody thought was a good idea. One of the critical things that was said tonight, I just need to clarify because it's going to be very impactful to this effort, is that the recommendation that's being made right now is that PWSA be placed into a receivership.
No.
Is that correct?
No, what was said was there are efforts in Harrisburg to create a legislative
to create
structure.
the legislation, but the
Correct.
What we offered was simply an alternative for heading that off with something of our own of the city's own creation.
And we could
because we'd love to not have to
Yeah, I understand it may get in the way
tell
of your bond.
investors that that's a potential thing now
May-
in December of 2017.
Sure. So I understand it may get in the way of your bond issuance, but I think what's being contemplated is that the city's ownership of the asset plus the city's interest in the leasehold to PWSA would be the corpus of the trust that's being created. So the idea being that the board and PWSA would operate accountable to a trust structure. But again, we're at a recommendation stage right now. Obviously that would take time to incorporate, and we could work
That
with
just
you.
was raising a lot of flags, and
Could
on
I
the
just say,
website will, so.
Well, and I'm not worried
Thank you.
about a bond issue, but I also don't like the word receivership, and I think it's an unfortunate one. What we're really talking about is some kind of interim arrangement, right?
Correct.
Could we just call it an interim arrangement instead of receivership?
Well,
Yeah, to be clear, the receivership is the conversation in Harrisburg around,
No, no, no.
and
I'm
I don't think
talking
that's
about-
anything that we even would have the power to do ourselves. I think what we're looking at is
She's
creating.
quite right in being concerned that our consultant used the word receivership in their recommendations. So that's, but
So
what you
we'll
really
make
mean
sure
is
that's
interim-
clarified.
Interim arrangement.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other questions, discussions? Okay. Meeting adjourned. Thank you.